Think of the evilest person in history who caused the death of millions. According to political scientist Rudolf Rommel, Nobel Prize nominee for his work on genocide, there are quite a few to choose from, including Genghis Khan, Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, Kim Il-sung, and Pol Pot. Now here's the question. If you were able to save the lives of millions by killing one of these men before they were able to carry out their evil, would you do it? Here's an even harder question. What if it wasn't just an individual, but an entire culture that, if left to spread, would destroy the world? What would you do if the only option left was to intervene in that culture? Hi, I'm Kirk, and I'm a scientist and a philosopher and a person who spends a lot of time thinking about the why questions in life. So if you're interested in discussions pertaining to God, science, and life, then please subscribe to my channel here, where I'll be posting on a regular basis. You can also subscribe to my social media accounts, and the links are below. One reason many people choose not to put their faith in God is that they disagree with the command He gave to Israel to destroy the inhabitants of the land that they were about to be given. On the surface, some would call this genocide, but let's take a deeper, more thoughtful look at this, just in case we find out that there's more to the story. When we do this, we discover some fascinating glimpses on how God directs history. Let's start by putting God's commands right out on the table. I'll pick what some would regard as the worst one of all. Here it is. You shall not leave alive anything that breathes, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite and the Perizzite, the Hivite and the Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that they may not teach you to do according to all their detestable things which they have done for their gods. Well, there you have it. If we just stopped right there, as probably at least 90% of people do, we'd be left wondering how this could possibly be good or justified. I have found, however, that it can be quite enlightening when I encounter a person with whom I might disagree to hear them out. Listen to what they have to say. When I do that, I have often found that my initial reaction was based on a lack of knowledge and understanding of where the other person was coming from. So let's take a closer look. To begin, did you observe the reason that was stated? I won't repeat it here. It was just a test to see how observant you are. We'll come back to that. First, however, we should define genocide so that we are all on the same page. Britannica defines genocide as the deliberate and systemic destruction of a group of people because of their ethnicity, nationality, religion, or race. One question we need to answer is if the termination of the Canaanite culture was actually genocide or something else. The first question to ask ourselves is this: why should we even worry about this? My point is that we never seem to get upset over what some non-existent mythical being does in some fairy tale. It only becomes an issue if such a being actually exists and really did make such a command. So to legitimately be upset about this requires that God actually exists and gave that command. But this raises another point. Many people choose not to believe in God because they disagree with what God commanded. But how does it logically follow that if God says something we disagree with, then He doesn't exist? I might not 100% agree with the way Elon Musk runs SpaceX, but I suspect he is a good deal more intelligent than I. So this is not surprising. But would it not be absurd if He ceased to exist the moment someone disagreed with Him? With this in mind, I would put God at quite a few notches in intelligence above any of us mere humans. So we should fully expect that if He orchestrates history and intervenes, it may be the height of hubris, if not bordering on insanity, to think we should always agree with how God directs history. In the case of the Canaanite conquest, however, there are some clues. One thing we should always ask when facing something that seems odd or unacceptable to us is to ask the golden question: is there a backstory? It turns out that there is. 400 years earlier, God told Abraham that this land would be given to his descendants, but not for another 4 centuries. The reason God gave for the delay was that the moral decay of the Canaanites was not yet at the tipping point. To clarify, the long-term consequences of the Canaanite society at the time of Abraham were still net positive, meaning that the positive future consequences of permitting the culture at that time to continue outweighed the negative future consequences. The tipping point would be reached, however, in another 4 centuries. Let's pause a moment to think about the implications of this. If all we knew was the cherry-picked quote I mentioned near the beginning of this video, then we should be mystified as to why God ordered the destruction of that culture. This, however, gives us a glimpse into God's orchestration of history and what factors might be of the greatest importance. In this case, the moral effect of that culture, not just at a present moment in history, but centuries and even millennia into the future. 4 centuries later, the morality of the Canaanites had apparently started to go into free fall. For example, in Leviticus chapter 18, God gives a list of sexual and cruel activities that the Canaanites practiced. That's 400 years later. Note that the word practiced is used, implying that these activities were not isolated events, but generally engaged in Canaanite culture as a matter of daily living. The list included incest, sex with animals, same-sex relations, adultery, and human sacrifices using one's own children. Now, I know today that our culture regards sexual freedom as a good thing, increasing our opportunities for pleasure and mutual enjoyment. However, according to the research of Oxford social anthropologist J.D. Unwin's study of 86 cultures, no culture survived more than 3 generations once they experienced a relaxation of sexual restraints. He also observed 3 effects that preceded the collapse, all 3 of which are very evident in our culture today. The data of history showed that there were no exceptions, and our culture is fitting perfectly into the pattern that Unwin discovered. If you want to look at Unwin's research more closely, check out my article on Unwin's findings in the link below. My point here is that given the data of human history, Canaanite culture was on the verge of collapse from the moral implosion that was already destroying their culture. Now, I expect that you might be thinking this is a very convenient excuse to justify the invasion of Canaan. So let's take a look at that. 2 things come to mind. First, if they had just made up this command of God to justify their invasion, then obviously God never actually commanded them to destroy the Canaanites. Therefore, we needn't concern ourselves with why God commanded their destruction, because he didn't actually do it. The only reason to discuss this in the first place is if we grant that God commanded it. But if God commanded it, then we need to take seriously the statement made 400 years earlier, as well as its fulfillment. Second, if the Israelites just made this up, it is unlikely they would also portray themselves as close to the tipping point and eventually suffering the same fate some 900 years later at the hands of the Babylonians, when they would reach a point of moral depravity even worse than the Canaanites they had displaced. The point to make here is that there's no double standard when it comes to a group of people who cross the tipping point of evil. What happened to the Canaanites at the hands of Israel also happened to Israel at the hands of the Assyrians and Babylonians when they too reached a moral tipping point. Another question you may be considering is this: were there not at least a few good Canaanites worth saving? That's a very good question, and it does seem implausible that 100% of all the people were so corrupt they had to be destroyed. What we find in answer to that question is rather surprising. God told Israel, "I will send hornets ahead of you so that they will drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites before you. I will not drive them out before you in a single year, so that the land may not become desolate and the beasts of the field become too numerous for you. I will drive them out before you little by little." There are a couple mentions of this plague of hornets that cleared much of the land ahead of the arrival of Israel. Notice that if it happened too fast, the land would revert to its wild state before Israel could cultivate it. This suggests that the majority of Canaanites were removed from the land prior to the arrival of Israel. Only those that remained would be destroyed. What is remarkable about this is that God followed the same pattern when destroying Israel from that same land some 900 years later. In that case, the good Jews were removed to Babylon, and all who remained were destroyed. We see the same pattern followed at the end of human history, where those people who belong to God will be removed from the earth, and all who remain will be destroyed. The point to grasp is that most of the Canaanites were not so morally evil that they had to be destroyed. Instead, only the evilest who remained would be destroyed. The majority of survivors would be dispersed into other nations where they could resume their lives in a different culture. This brings us back to the question of genocide and what happened to the Canaanites. Recall that Britannica defines genocide as the deliberate and systemic destruction of a group of people because of their ethnicity, nationality, religion, or race. In the case of the Canaanites, several passages imply that the majority of Canaanites were not to be destroyed, but driven out of the land ahead of time through an ongoing plague of hornets. Only the remaining minority were destroyed. Secondly, they were not destroyed for their ethnicity, nationality, religion, or race. Instead, it was because they had reached a moral tipping point of evil beyond which the long-term pain and suffering consequences for humanity outweighed whatever good consequences there might have been for allowing them to continue their spread of evil. An analogy might be a surgeon who removes a gangrenous limb to save the body, where the surgeon represents God and the gangrenous limb represents a minority portion of humanity who have crossed the moral tipping point. Well, perhaps you're worried that we might be tempted to justify a war or an invasion on the basis that the other country has reached a moral tipping point. The problem is, only a being who transcends time is in a position to know what the consequences to the end of history are for any person or group, and what the net sum of the moral value of those consequences will be. Since we do not have that knowledge, it follows that no human is in a position to know when any sort of moral tipping point is reached by another culture. So we certainly cannot justify a war on that basis. Another question that I expect pops into your head is this: what about other cultures that were invaded or destroyed? Were they morally bankrupt as well? Well, the majority of invasions and wars throughout history were driven by greed, ambition, power, and the pursuit of wealth. It certainly does not follow that all invaders are good and all victims are evil, not by any stretch of the imagination. For every event in this world, God, as the one who decides what must be prevented and what must be allowed, bases his decisions on the knowledge of how each event affects every other event to the end of history. In this gigantic mix, God says that even his own people suffer and are killed for their faith. Only God knows how everything sums up at the end of history. What happened to the Canaanites raises a larger question. God did not just talk about the Canaanites. He also said a lot of similar things about human civilization near the end of history. How close are we? More importantly, as an individual, will I be among those who belong to God and are rescued, or will I be among those left behind to witness the final end of human history at the moral tipping point some call Armageddon? Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, or at least found it thought-provoking. And if you did, please share it, or you can leave a comment in the section below. And also, don't forget to hit the like button.